Oh, awesome. We are live. Happy Saturday evening, everyone. It's making a bit of a habit for this. I don't know why. Just kind of have been feeling the muse lately. Maybe you take a long break and then it's time to get back into it, or I don't know. So, this is something that I've talked about once or twice before, but there's been a lot of reporting lately by Michael Schellenberger, who's really kind of come out as something of a major whistleblower, kind of on the level of Matt Taibbi or Glenn Greenwald even. I've read some of his books. He's a very interesting guy, kind of iconoclastic in the sense that he's a classical liberal in the American political sense, who's become much more center and really a refreshing voice. Somebody who seems to be trying to be honest and intellectually rigorous. Obviously, I don't share his politics all the way. He's not a libertarian. He would, although he has certain libertarian tendencies, he would obviously not. I mean, he said, "Oh, you're supposed to pay taxes. You have to pay taxes." Um, but he's recently come out with a piece on WPath. So WPath is something that I've heard of before. They're kind of getting more press lately. WPath stands for the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And his reporting on that comes from a series of basically leaks of video, conference calls, and documentation showing several really worrying trends. So the WPath is kind of like the world leader in recommending and advocating for the medical transition of everyone, but in particular of minors. And it shows that some of the logical and ethical questions a lot of people would have for something like that. Um, what are how can a minor consent to something so rigorous, so extreme? How can they understand what they're doing when they're giving up things that they've maybe never experienced, probably never have experienced? What are the side effects? What are the long-term risks? What are the actual benefits? There are claimed benefits. What is the evidence for those? And although a lot of people have raised those questions, WPath has kind of hand waved them away and say, all that's fine. That if this health care is not given, that these patients are going to kill themselves, or at least there's a higher risk of that. And they know what they want. There's something very fascinating about the trans ideology in that gender is totally fluid. You can be anything that you want. No one's really male, no one's really female. The only thing that is solid that never changes is your trans identity. If you're trans, that's immutable. Like you're just trans and you always were trans, and it's kind of like a soul, actually, something that was there before you were born and there after you die, and you can never get rid of it no matter what. What Schellenberger's reporting has shown is that the doctors within WPath understand that these minors don't understand consent. They don't understand what they're being asked. They don't understand what they're losing. They don't understand what they're consenting to. That the data that's being used to justify these operations is extremely bad. That it's very low quality, very small sets, and that the organization of WPath is very strongly ideologically motivated and probably also motivated by sexual preferences of the people involved. Now, this is something that I had never really heard before, but there's this thing called autogynephilia. Autogynephilia is the sexualization of imagining the opposite sex version of yourself and being attracted to that. So if you were a man, imagining a female version of yourself and being sexually attracted to that person or wishing that you were that person. Autogynephilia seems to almost entirely exist of men fantasizing about themselves as women. It seems just by law of numbers that there would be a counterexample of females who fantasize about themselves being males. I think, though, that the literature shows that if that is real, it's much, much, much more rare. But that a high proportion of trans females, that is male to female, and especially a high proportion within WPath, fall into this category. And this raises a huge question that what they are purporting as medicine, as objective, as for the good of everyone, is actually something that they have a huge sexual fetish for. Now, this is probably not true of everyone. It's not true of all trans people, I'm sure, but it's probably a factor for some, and it's something that's not being disclosed. Now, and I've commented about this before. What's interesting when you see the likes of Matt Walsh, or especially Ben Shapiro, and also Michael Schellenberger, who maybe it's not so clear with him because I don't know how he stands on this other issue, but when they talk about the abuses of applying or inflicting, however you want to describe it, medical transition to minors. And it's interesting that they always say minors. As much as I'm sure Matt Walsh doesn't like trans people or thinks that trans people are, that they have a mental disease, he doesn't really raise a lot of ethical problems with people deciding to transition as adults. Now, he does draw the line with compelled speech, the whole Jordan Peterson line. You can, do what you want, but you can't force me to call you a woman. But he's not saying that, at least as far as I know, that we should prevent people who are legal adults from, doing what they want as far as that is concerned. But there's a big, big issue with doing it to minors, to children. And this raises a bunch of questions about the age of consent and what it should be and what are the factors that go into that. Questions that are not really dealt with, where there's kind of a feeling to just default go with what is the law. So if the law says you're a legal adult when you're 18, then you're 18. If it says that you're 16, then you're 16, and they don't really grapple with it beyond that. But the other thing that's ironic is that they'll say things like you're doing genital surgery, you're cutting away genitals, you're cutting away part of genitals. It's a sexual fetish, it's a religion. The idea that transism is a sexual, is some form of like atheistic or Marxist religion, that you're taking away healthy tissue, that there's no benefit, that it causes harm. And as far as it goes, all of those things are very justifiable and as far as you can say, factually correct. But what's interesting is all those things would also apply to infant circumcision. Now, there are definitely differences of degree. I am not someone who's going to say that infant circumcision is the same in degree as complete removal of the testes, complete removal of the penis, and putting someone on estrogen and hormone, right? That's obviously much more invasive. That's much bigger, but that is a difference of degree, not in kind. You're still talking about removing healthy tissue. You're talking about removing functional sexual equipment. You're talking about altering the genitals in a way that is essentially irreversible. You're doing it without consent. Typically, with circumcision, you're doing it when they're only weeks or months old, not even, 10 to 20, right? So there's a big, what about the ethics? Can a 14-year-old, consent to this surgery? And there's good reasons to say they probably can't. But then that's even more so for somebody who's 8 days old. And it's interesting. I don't know. These guys all seem smart to me. I'm wondering if it's just the cognitive dissonance is so high that they don't see the obvious and direct parallels. When I've seen people like Ben Shapiro confronted about circumcision, nobody has come at it from if it's wrong to, medically transition somebody and cut away their genitals for that, why is it not wrong to do it when they're much younger and for equally silly reasons? But the other thing is that's so ominous, and the parallels are so interesting. Is, having been a long time critic of infant circumcision and somebody who's has immersed himself in the debate as much as I can, one thing that you come up with a lot, one of the reasons that it's persisted in the United States for so long, is that it has a certain degree of cachet with the medical establishment. Now, in the United States, we don't have a national health service. We don't have a national, governing body that controls all the healthcare like you might have in, say, with the NHS in the UK. But you have all of these different associations: the American Medical Association, the Association of Optometrists, the Association of Ophthalmologists, of oncologists, whatever the case may be. And Schellenberger talks in his reporting, and there was a great interview he did this recently. If I can find it, I'll put the link. But it's within the last week. Just look up Michael Schellenberger. He did an interview in the UK that I thought was fascinating. But he talks about the chain of trust, and the idea is that even people who are medical professionals, people who are doctors, they don't have the time to specialize in everything. So your oncologist is probably not going to stay up to date with everything about plastic surgery or pediatric medicine or whatever. And so there's a tendency to defer to the main associations, if they exist, for any particular aspect of the medical industry or the medical field. And in the case of trans people, WPath has been that. WPath has kind of put itself in this position. There's a whole history there that I've heard described. I don't know. I'm not super familiar with it. You can look it up yourself. But they became the de facto kind of authority when it came to this sort of stuff. And the people in it, they are doctors, right? They do have diplomas. They have degrees. They know the nomenclature. They are conversant. And so it's not like somebody who would instantly appear not to have the status or the bona fides to have an opinion about this. And so other doctors will then defer to them. And we have a very similar thing with circumcision with the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP. So for those of you who are not super familiar with the debate, but within the United States, kind of the one thing that is used to officially sanction and justify circumcision as beneficial is it's supposed to be every 5 years, the AAP will make, general recommendations. And they have continuously for many years recommended that circumcision be done. Now, interestingly, their last 5-year recommendation was done, I think, 8 or 9 years ago, and they have not renewed it, which means by its own measure, it's now void. What's interesting about that document is it uses all kinds of extremely bad reasoning, bad empiricism, and marshals many, many arguments that are strictly not medical at all. They'll talk about culture. They'll talk about religion. And it's also clear that many of the doctors involved in the drafting of that document themselves are highly, highly biased. One of the doctors, several of the doctors are Jewish, but one of the doctors, not only Jewish, but he circumcised his own son on the dining room table with his fingernail, right? He peeled the foreskin off with his thumbnail, which is the traditional way it's done in many versions of the Brit Milah among many Jews. And he said that when he did that, he didn't do it for any medical benefit or because he thought it would protect for HIV or anything like that, STIs. He did it because, quote, 3,000 years of my ancestors were looking over my shoulders. And you can feel whatever you want about his connection with his ancestors and his culture and his religious commitment, which seemed to be very strong. But then it begs the question, how much did that influence his conclusions that he reached in the AAP recommendation that circumcision be, and this recommendation is used to endorse it being covered by Medicaid and Medicare, right? So in the United States, we don't have a national health service, but we do have a lot of government subsidy of healthcare. This is one thing that I think a lot of Europeans, to juxtapose themselves from the United States, will pretend like the United States has a free market in healthcare and the government's not involved, where they have a much better government system. And I think it's at this point something like 2/3 of all medical spending comes from some level of government. But you know, the United States federal government and the state governments and municipalities all subsidize uh, uh, medical care, and they include circumcision on that. Now, this is something that's slowly changed. Some states have basically said that circumcision is not medically necessary, therefore it should not be covered by Medicaid. And that's the whole point of Medicaid, is not that you go to get plastic surgery or elective surgeries, it's for necessary surgeries, which even the AAP and its very biased pronouncements never says that it's necessary. They say that the costs the benefits outweigh the costs, although they do not measure the costs. And the benefits include things like culture and religion. So, I mean, how can you do a cost-benefit analysis if you're just going to ignore all the costs, which they do? They overstate the benefits, including make-believe benefits, and then ignore the costs. But even they don't say it's necessary. They just say the benefits outweigh the risks. Yeah, this thin reed, this single nail, is the linchpin that holds so much of the official recommendation. This is why insurance companies will cover it, and this is what doctors will cite. You know, if parents ask, well, what is the medical wisdom, then they are the authorities, at least when it comes to pediatrics. It's interesting that this is probably still cited even if you were an adult. Like if you were 25 and you were uncircumcised and you were talking to your doctor about it, it's not inconceivable that they would defer to the AAP, even though AAPP they're not gynecologists per se. They're the American Academy of Pediatrics. But the thing to notice, though, that I'm kind of skirting around is that many of the people in the AAP clearly are biased. And it's not just that they're Jewish, although many of them are. There's also some evidence that some of them have a fetish for circumcising baby penises. Now, this is something that it shares in common with WPath. See, now, genitalia are interesting because they have a much larger footprint in the psychology of people, right? So if you have an appendix or an appendectomy or a tonsil or a tonsillectomy, people don't go around identifying as I've had an appendectomy or I've had a tonsillectomy, or I consider myself a tonsil person or a handed person. These are not things in people's identity. But people do wrap themselves up in especially men in this case. I don't know about women. People can comment about this if I have any women in the audience. But so I don't know if women feel this way about their vaginas or not, or their boobs, but guys very often, not always, you know, they're vested in their genitalia, right? It's a big part of their self-identity. And if they are circumcised, then very often circumcision becomes, for good or ill, a big part of their identity. And they often then feel, I mean, there's a ton of potential, and I should be careful. These are probabilistic things. So, you know, if you circumcise 1 million boys, that does not mean all of them are going to become self-consciously team circumcision and want to spread circumcision, but a certain percentage of them will. And the problem is that if they feel strongly about this and they're doctors, then they have a very big incentive to put themselves in a position to do something about it. So we have a gynec, Brian Morrison, if I can remember. Now, Brian Morrison is a doctor in Australia who has made it his entire life's mission to justify and promote circumcision. He goes much further than anyone else. He's done interviews where he said that if you don't circumcise your child, that you're abusing them. To not circumcise is to abuse. He does this entire routine where anytime any research is ever done that shows that circumcision is either not effective, like harmful, or that there's benefits to foreskin, he will lodge a complaint. It might just be a letter to the editor. His complaints may not take the form of a study. They may just be a letter that he wrote that's unpublished. And then he will also publish his own studies, meta studies, or repeat meta studies showing the benefits of circumcision. And without going into all of them, because each one is different, but all of them are quite bad in terms of their epistemology, their empiricism, all kinds of things. But then he'll do a meta-analysis where he will include all of the pro-circumcision studies, and exclude all of the anti-circumcision things. And he will cite, well, the anti-circumcision things I'm excluding because there was an objection, but then the objection will be the letter that he wrote, right? And this takes a lot of effort on his part, but it's very, very clear he has a big, big dog in this fight. He's very, very vested in the idea of circumcision being done to children, especially, that it's child abuse if you don't do it. And it goes way, way, way beyond, a doctor who simply, oh, well, the AAP says, so I'm going to suggest it. And there is evidence that him and a few other people, there's one, I forget his name, he died recently, he was on the AAP, who specifically, they were members of an organization called, I believe it was called the Galal Society, where they would share videos of infant circumcisions with each other and talk about it in a way that it gave them pleasure to see this being done, that they're in some way dominating, converting, surgically altering, asserting their will through a medical act to truncate the sexuality of these little boys. Now, I do not think your average doctor who's doing circumcision is thinking that. I'm not saying that. But there's a small minority who there is evidence that do feel that way. And those people, if they have the ability and the means, end up in places like AAP. And then they make it their business to make circumcision as acceptable. Oh, my nose is bleeding. Thanks, guys. I'm just so passionate about this. Yeah, sorry. Edgar Schoen, so thank you. Yeah, Edgar Schoen has been dead for a while. He's the one I was thinking of. He was in the Galal Society, and I think Brian Morris also was. Yeah, I have the way my camera is set up, I can't actually see the video of my face, so I can see the top of my head, but I can't see my nose. Sorry. I was in the sauna a bit too long. Sorry, guys. It does seem, though, that even though these numbers are small, they're very strategically placed. They've incentivized themselves to go there. And I think we see a similar thing with WPath, where some of these FTM men, MTF men, male to female, trans men, are autogynephilic. And they kind of have put themselves in a position to, in union with a lot of the, I don't want to say woke, but the critical race theory, the critical gender theory, the Marxists in the academia, who then say you can't really question, because they're authentic minority trans people, that you can't question them and say, oh man, well, maybe they are just think this is all really, really hot. But there's emerging evidence that this is indeed the case. Explaining, Greg, nice to see you, by the way. Explaining circumcision fetishism to lay people is difficult. I describe it as an intersection of hardcore sadism, pedophilia, and some people get it. Yeah, so, I mean, there's different levels of it. I mean, there's some people who just find it aesthetically pleasing. There are some people who have germaphobe. I saw a video not too long ago of a fairly prominent YouTuber who's from Germany, who got circumcised when he was 18, and he experienced no peer pressure or anything like that, but he just was self-conscious that he was afraid of germs, and he associated foreskin with germs. He knew that circumcision was supposed to eliminate germs, and so he got circumcised. And this was now, he's making this video a couple years later. He's saying, oh, it's not so different, but he kind of casually mentions that he can't masturbate anymore. That prior to being circumcised, he could masturbate very easily, and that's how he would get off. And now he just can't do it anymore. I mean, the way that he's wrong in the sense, like, you can still masturbate if you're circumcised, but it's a very different technique. Typically, there's more than one technique either way, but like functionally, the main ways you would masturbate as an uncircumcised man, or as a restored man for that matter, are just functionally very different. And so I guess he hasn't learned that yet, but I'll just say, as someone who's done a little bit of both, that masturbating with a foreskin is way better than masturbating without a foreskin. No question about it. But just kind of like blithely, I can't masturbate anymore. Like, wow, maybe make a whole video about that. That's like a huge, huge issue. But you do have a lot of people who are like cut fetishists, and typically they're just going to be some guy, and they're not going to have any authority or power. They're not going to be able to um, like really influence other people, at least not at the medical association level. But they they're out there, and if they become, and there's another thing, doctors have a lot of power over their patients. And we have this mental image of doctors that they care, they're nurturing, and that's, that's not an undeserved thing, and many of them do feel that way. But they see life and death all the time, right? They see many, many patients. They help them. They are well paid typically, and we can especially see this when circumcision was popularized. And I've talked about this a lot, and this is a really interesting topic. There's a fantastic book about this called the Surgical Temptation. And if you go back in the mid to late 19th century, we really hadn't, the germ theory medicine was just starting. Louis Pasteur and the other pioneers in germ medicine were coming through in the 1860s and 70s. But that was even only theoretical, and well into up to World War I, even really it was not well established everywhere that bacteria and viruses and these microorganisms are what cause a lot of disease. They certainly don't cause all disease, but they cause a lot of it. And until penicillin came around, with the minor exception of inoculation, there really wasn't much they could do. But what they could do was surgery, right? They figured out in the in the 1830s and 40s about sterilization, that if you clean and sterilize your medical instruments, you could perform surgery and reasonably expect not to kill your patients and not to have them die of infection after. Prior to that, getting surgery done for any reason was extremely risky, because you would probably get infected and you may well die from that infection. And we've all heard the saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all you have is surgery, then the answer to every ailment is surgery. And you can totally understand how then they might conclude, well, of all these problems that people have, any problems associated with the genitals, with any STD, and of course, they vested all kinds of things that even not specific to STDs or genitals. So like schizophrenia, epilepsy, spermatorrhea, which is not a real disease, it's a made up disease, but was a big thing. People, onanism, all the anti-masturbation, actual stuff. What's the solution? Well, they didn't have drugs back then. They didn't have the psychotherapy, but they did have surgery. And so it's understandable that they say, well, let's find a surgical solution. And circumcision, as far as surgeries go, is one of the easiest. And there is a tendency among some of these early physicians, they see themselves as having power over the body, power over man. And this would be true for any surgery. So they would feel maybe the same way for, an appendectomy or a tonsillectomy or a mastectomy, right? But some of these doctors, when you get to the early 20th century, a lot of them are on cocaine, but like they're just cut, and seeing how much they can cut and not kill the patient, to the point where they're going totally overboard. But like, we're obviously not in that period now, but the custom was established at that point. That's when it became popularized and common. And unlike, again, appendectomies, if you had a generation where everybody, let's say something had happened in the 50s, and there had been some quack but popular theory, and 90% of the people in the United States in the 1950s had their appendixes removed, right? It was common procedure for sure, but it was never that common. But let's say that it happened, and everyone had an appendectomy. When those people grew up and had children, which they can still do without an appendix, you can survive without an appendix. they wouldn't really have any psychological predisposition to want to spread their appendectomal status to their children. But this is not necessarily true with circumcision. Circumcised men often want their sons to be circumcised too. They want them to match, or whatever other psychological things going on. There's more than I don't want to generalize and say it's the same thing all the time, because it's not. And there's the confounding factor that they have doctors telling them that they should do that. So even if whatever their psychological status is or is not, the fact that the AAP is telling them that they should do it is obviously a complicating factor. But I'm just saying that there's a strong psychological element that's not there for procedures that are not dealing with someone's sexual identity in such a profound way. But that is the similarity that it has with WPath and trans surgeries. So I would love if all the people now engaged in trans activism would. By the way, the reporting on WPath is so bad that it seems this is starting to get reversed in a lot of countries, and I think it's so damning that we're going to see this start to get reversed here. And again, you know, my dog is in the circumcision fight, not in the trans fight. I'm not trans. I don't know any trans people. It's not something I'm ever going to have to deal with, really. But I will acknowledge that in terms of an individual impact, it's far, far worse. Now, ethically, it's a little bit more mixed, because you're starting to deal with people who are getting to the point, and perhaps they're not there yet, where consent isn't the issue that it is with neonatal circumcision. There is no consent involved in neonatal circumcision, none. And we don't allow parents to have that kind of authority to amputate any other healthy body part. It doesn't matter if your religion says that, you know, babies should not have earlobes. You cannot amputate your baby's earlobes because your religion says so. Completely wrong. And you certainly can't circumcise your daughter, even if it's a more mild, you know, less invasive version than male circumcision. I know that there are versions of female circumcision that are much more invasive than typical male circumcision. However, there are other versions of female circumcision that are much more minor, up to the point of like a ceremonial pinprick, which leaves no scar and removes no tissue. Whatever you want to say or feel about that, that's demonstrably less invasive than male circumcision is. And yet we don't allow that. That's obviously whatever authority parents have, and I grant they should justifiably have a very wide latitude. There's a degree of fiduciary responsibility when you create a life, that life has rights that supersede your parental authority. And you can take them to church, and you can feed them whatever diet, and you can take them to piano lessons, and you can give them toys or not give them toys. And, you know, I would go very far into what, and you certainly should not have the state forcing you to send them to school, or where to go to school, or what the curriculum should be. I agree with all of that, but you can't start cutting them up. Even if you really believe that that's right, or the dad was cut up or whatever. Now, with the trans debate, as people get older, and I think everyone agrees with this, there gets to be a point where you can consent to things that you couldn't previously. Now, where do you draw that line? That's a really good question, and there needs to be an intellectually honest debate about that question, which frankly seems almost impossible to have. Even people who are happy to talk about the trans issue or circumcision are very hesitant to really get into that. They kind of just accept the de facto, what are the laws? But of course, the laws vary on this all over the place, country to country, and even within the United States, and issue to issue. Not to go too much into it, but I think that the evidence is pretty strong that we don't develop in plateaus or in discrete sections, but gradually. You start to go through puberty. The day that you start to go through puberty, you have not changed enough for it to make any difference in terms of what you can and can't do ethically. But every day that goes on, you develop physically and mentally. And as you develop physically and mentally, the things that you can understand, the things that you can physically do and mentally understand to the point or consent becomes meaningful will increase as time goes on. But I think it's graduated. So you can agree to kiss someone, you can consent to a kiss or holding hands before you can agree to having sex or getting married, right? You can probably agree to having sex before you can agree to getting married. When does that happen? It's different for, I mean, the true answer is that it's different for every person. People develop at different rates and in different ways. Some people never develop that way. Some people, even when they're 25, are not mature enough, smart enough, cognitively coherent enough to consent to anything. Like they can't consent to working at a job. They can't consent to a medical procedure. They can't own a bank account. They can't do anything. Other people can do it earlier. And depending on the person and the thing that we're talking about, I think very often people can do it earlier than the current laws allow. But on that spectrum, a medical transition would be one of the very last, if not the last thing you could ever agree to, because it is the most far-reaching and it is the hardest to assess. I would also say that if you can't, if you're talking about precluding things that you've never experienced, it's very difficult to see how that's justified. And to pull this back into the circumcision debate, I had an experience at PorkFest maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I was wearing a pro foreskin shirt. Had a lot of interesting conversations with people, tended to be pretty positive. The only people who didn't agree, there were some, libertarian Jews, and they even straight up said, I mean, I'm talking about one guy in particular. Look, I'm not even going to argue. There's no ethical justification, but Rothbard said you get one exception, and this is my one exception. I guess an exception to ethics, I suppose. But one person came up to me and said, I want to tell you something about that. I have something to say about that. And I thought this was going to be confrontational. I thought that he was going to argue with me. And no, quite the contrary. He said that his parents had left him intact quite deliberately, that they thought that should be, quote, his choice. There was none of their business. So they're expressing, at least in terms of this, an understanding that even as his parents, he has rights that supersede their authority and that they need to respect them. Now, I don't know if they felt that about everything and we were 100%, but on that issue, I think that they were very, very correct. He, on the other hand, regretted not being circumcised. He felt that he was different. He felt that he didn't fit in. He literally never had a bad experience. He says he wasn't getting naked with his friends. None of his friends knew he was uncircumcised. He never got made fun of for it. He never experienced it. He never had a girlfriend who, rebuked him or got grossed out. That never happened. He just knew that he was different and felt different, and so was anxious about it. And he begged and begged and begged his parents to get him to be circumcised. And they deferred and said, no, you're not old enough. You're not old enough, until he was 13. And then they said, fine, you're old enough. You can get circumcised. And he did. And I mean, this guy is in his mid-20s when I'm talking to him, but he said it's the worst decision of his life, that it completely obliterated his sexual pleasure. Like that what was left was nothing compared to what was there before. And he really hates his parents. He didn't say hate, but he's really angry with his parents that they allowed him to do that, even though they had given him the choice and it was he who insisted. But he was a virgin at that point. He never had oral sex. He never had anal sex. He probably had masturbated. I didn't ask him. I would assume he did, but maybe not. And you could raise the very good question that, as a 13-year-old, he probably could agree to have a job or to have a bank account. There's lots of things he probably could have consented to, but how could he possibly have made that decision at that age? And if we apply that to the trans thing, it's even more, because that's an even bigger change. I see more ramifications and even more difficult. I mean, as an uncircumcised man, you really can't truly understand what you're giving up, because you don't know what it will, or more precisely, what it won't feel like. But that's even more difficult when you're talking about going on to hormones and going on to blockers and having lots of body parts removed and having them replaced with surgical facsimiles that they are not as good. I mean, people get by with them. They are, I'm assuming there's mixed results as far as that go, but you can't possibly know that when you're that young. There's another question too, where, and I never really thought about this until I'd seen it was a documentary about people with weird, whatever desires. And this was a guy who's, he's since committed suicide. I don't remember his name, but he had a fetish where he wanted to look like Justin Bieber, and he was getting whatever 20 plastic surgeries. He's spending hundreds of thousands of dollars that he didn't really have to have plastic surgeries to look like Justin Bieber, you know. And he would go into, and he already had many, so he was much older than Justin Bieber, so you couldn't quite pull it off. It was actually really sad because you could almost tell what he was going for. And you know, having the plastic surgeries will not give you the fame or talent or charisma of Justin Bieber. And it's really quite sad and pathetic, actually. But he would go meet a plastic surgeon and say, well, I want, you know, and he would specify like my jaw or my cheeks. And then he would pull out a big picture, like a high quality picture of Justin Bieber, like, I want it like this. And I remember the plastic surgeon saying, look, everything that you're asking for, I can do. It's, you know, this is run of the mill plastic surgery. But before I do it, I want you to see a psychiatrist, because I want you to talk to them, because and I never really thought about this before, but yeah, you don't want to give surgery to a crazy person, right? And there's a very real possibility that you could have someone who's not crazy, who genuinely wants something, but then the provider of that is in a position where they really can't ethically do it anyway, because there's no way for them to know for sure. And I do think that when you're talking about minors, especially if they have no sexual experience, if they haven't even gone through puberty yet, so they don't even know what they're going to miss, I don't think that you can do it. Now, the counter to this is that it does seem true that for male to female transitioners, they have a more likelihood of passing if they are able to do it before puberty, right? Because once you go through puberty, your height, your bone structure, your Adam's apple, there's a lot of features that basically can't be removed. They're not going to be able to make you shorter. They're not going to make your arms, you know, I mean, Will Thompson is 6'4", because whatever he's done, whatever minimal things he's done were done post puberty. And so the argument is, well, but if you can start before puberty, they are much more likely to pull off passing. First of all, not all trans people appear to want to pass. Very often, some trans people do seem to be really going for, I want to look exactly like, or as close to, I want everyone to think that I'm a woman or a man. And others are trying to do that and just can't because of the logistical reality that they find themselves in. And there's yet others, and I don't know what the breakdown is, who they're trying to look trans. They're trying to look like this new thing called trans that's neither, you know, it doesn't fit either. But you can't anticipate who that's going to be. So, you know, people will, to parallel with the circumcision debate, there are a certain number of men who, if are left intact as children, will decide when they're adults that they want to get circumcised for whatever reasons. Some of them may, quote unquote, need it. Circumcisions are medically vastly overprescribed. I would say that they're never or almost never actually medically necessary. There's always other interventions that can get the job done and most of them are non-surgical. But there's always going to be some who, for aesthetic reasons or maybe religious reasons, like if you convert to Judaism, I know a guy who was Jewish, but he was from the UK, so he wasn't circumcised. But he got more serious about his Judaism, and when he was like 30, he got circumcised. Okay, like I wouldn't have done that, but ethically, I mean, we're in the clear here. He had his experiences, he had a lot of experiences, and that was his choice to make. But you would not then use that to take, even in the United States, which is a society that stigmatizes foreskin, or at least has up till now, and where the medical profession is strongly encouraging people to get it done by and large. And in some places, this is like strangely insistent. Other places, it's more mild. They've done surveys of women who are expecting to have their first son, and it's something like, how many times are they solicited about having their son circumcised? And it's something like 20 or 30 times, where medical professionals are asking them, "Do you want them? Do you want them circumcised?" But the number of men who decide to get circumcised as an adult is small. It's something less than 5%. And so to then go and say, we should circumcise all the boys because a small percentage of them will end up wanting that, is completely unjustified and a total miscarriage of ethics. And so, yes, it is true that there is a certain number of people who are going to transition when they ethically can, when they're adults, that they're going to make that decision in the most informed way that you can. And some of those people probably would have been better off in terms of passing, if that's what they want, had they transitioned earlier. But for many, many, many others, that's not the case. And so to justify it for everyone so that small minority can get their better outcome is unjustified. Now, I don't know about a legal ban necessarily, but I think the doctors should, I mean, it shouldn't be covered, it shouldn't be subsidized, and they should be very worried about getting sued later. You know, so yeah, let's see what people have to say. Glad you guys can hear my nose still bleeding. That's not too bad. The conservative response to doctors pushing for kids transitioning is that the moral and philosophical issues outside of the purview of medicine, which should be the exact same for circ. Yeah, the idea that the AAP is going to cite religion and culture, and that it's widely practiced in many cultures and many religions, which it is. It's not a rare practice. Some intactivists really try and, only the United States does it, but that's not really true. I mean, many Muslim countries practice male and female circumcision. Sometimes how and when they do it's different. So like in Turkey, they tend to circumcise boys when they're like 10. The Philippines does it. Lots of sub-Saharan Africa does it. So I think the total worldwide is like 30%. So that's a big group. It's a minority, but it's a big group. But when you start, when a Jewish doctor who says that he circumcised his son because 3,000 years of his ancestors were looking over his shoulder on the dining room table with his own fingernail, I don't know if he sucked the blood out with his mouth or not. He didn't specify. If he was doing a truly traditional Brit Milah, then that is what he would have done, or at least the Moyle would have done that. I don't know if he was the Moyle. He probably was. He says he did the circumcision, so he was the Moyle, I suppose. That maybe religion is playing a part in this. Now, there's also the very interesting question of like, did religion play? I mean, Christianity does not condone circumcision. In fact, if Christianity has a stance on circumcision, it's a vaguely negative one. There was a split in the church very early on. We're talking Peter Paul debates. So the first generation after Jesus, do people who become Christians need to get circumcised? And the winner of that debate was no. And then it even shifted to circumcision is like somebody trying to cheat code their way into heaven, and that's not the way. You get to heaven through coming to Christ and accepting him into your life, and Christ is your Lord and Savior, and not because you keep kosher, not because you don't wear mixed linens or don't eat shellfish or circumcise yourself. And not only that, then over the millennium, and what's interesting, and I mean, this is something I want to learn more about, but like post Common Era, so AD Judaism is very different from BCE Judaism. And in many ways, Judaism post Jesus has become the anti-Christian religion. They have defined themselves in opposition to and distinction from Christianity in many, many, many ways. Christians could be seen as a sect of Judaism. Jesus saw himself as the king of the Jews. They draw on the Old Testament. In fact, I would say Christians in general take the Old Testament a lot more seriously than Jews do. Jews today, if they're religious, are drawing much more on the Talmud. The Talmud is written in the post-Christian era, in the Common Era. And one of the things, and there are many, but one of the things that's making Jews distinct from Christians is that they're cutting their baby penises like largely off. And the Christians are seeing that and thinking that's really weird. And it's contributing a lot towards the antipathy towards the group. There are many other reasons for this. Anyone who's read the Talmud would understand that a Christian who would read the Talmud would not like that religion very much. And I don't speak as a Christian here, but it's pretty bad. I mean, it's not just Christians; it's all Gentiles are worse than snakes and dogs, and should be cursed and lied to, and are filthy, and that murder. You know, all these prohibitions against murder don't apply to Gentiles. It's only for other Jews. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of things about the religion that doesn't endear itself to people who are not members of the religion. And the baby cutting is definitely one of those things. And it's always been a problem. But when circumcision was popularized in the United States, it was not religious. It was not a revivalist. People were reading the Bible and were like, oh, it says circumcision in Genesis, so we should do it. It was medicalized. And if there was a religious element at all, it was a Victorian and puritanical revolt against sex and sexual pleasure and sexual autonomy, masturbation, and specific spermatoria, again, a made-up disease. Spermatoria is essentially any discharge of seminal fluid that is not into your ovulating wife, basically. So if you jerk off and you come, if you pre-cum, if you have a nocturnal emission, all those things are wrong unless you're doing it into your wife to get her pregnant. Everything else is a problem, and maybe we can solve that problem by cutting off your foreskin and reducing your pleasure. And this was another big thing, that we want to reduce your sexual pleasure. We want to reduce the thrill you get from playing with your penis or using your penis. And so it became popularized. And then 50, 60, 70 years later, when the culture became more sex positive, the justification for circumcision shifted to, it doesn't reduce sexual pleasure at all. It's cleaner because we're protecting you from cancer. And then when the AIDS came up, then they said they were protecting you from AIDS. And it's that's crazy. They were protecting us from AIDS in the 1920s and the 1890s. But the early doctors, many of them were Jewish, but it's hard to see. There is no documentary evidence that shows that their Judaism explicitly motivated their promotion of circumcision. And indeed, the doctors who did the most to promote it were Gentiles. Okay. They were doctors who saw themselves as triumphing over nature, triumphing over man through surgery, through their, their Nietzschean control of the scalpel. And I don't know, Jewish identity, this is interesting. Do Jews see themselves as, in Europe, they're distinguished. In the United States, they're not distinguished because so many of the Gentiles are circumcised that it's like, and in fact, I would even wonder if at this point, it's possible, this is probably not true. We don't really have numbers. It's possible that the circumcision rate among at least some groups of Jews is lower than the general population. And that therefore there might be types of Jews that are more likely to be intact than normal Americans, quote unquote. I would love to know. That would be very strange, but not impossible, because I mean, Judaism is very, very diverse, and you get a lot of variation there where this is possible. So like a big part of the intactivist movement is led by Jewish people, just like a big part of the anti-Zionist movement is led by Jews or contributed to by Jews. But would there be an idea that by doing this, we could blend in more, right? If everyone's circumcised, then no one is going to go to a pogrom because they're circumcised. And we think about, the Holocaust, and that's, I mean, if you've ever heard of foreskin restoration, people often associate that with the Holocaust and your Jews in the Pale of Settlement, trying to look uncut. But actually, this goes back to Roman times. The Romans, even in the time of in the Flavian emperors, started to kind of crack after the time of the Jewish revolt. They would actually examine people and look at, are you circumcised or not? Right. So like you could see some Jews maybe thinking, oh, maybe this way we'll all blend in. But then would that not then in a large degree eradicate their separateness, which a lot of them also cherish? So I don't know. People who have looked at this have not found any documentary evidence to that effect. So we don't have the Jewish Medical Journal of New England saying, let's do this so that all the Gentiles are cut like us. That we don't have any evidence for that. And again, Gentiles seem to have taken the lead in the United States. The AAP actually uses the phrase social benefits, which sounds a lot like witchcraft. Yeah, that is an interesting justification. There's another one where they say that it reduces the risk of cervical cancer for the woman. So we're going to amputate part of your body, not for your benefit, but for the potential benefit of one of your sexual partners. Crazy, right? Because you would never justify that any other way. Edgar Schoen. Just curious, are you still an ANCAP? I am still an ANCAP. Yeah, that has not changed. Can we do a Zoom call and talk about hypnosis? No, I'm not going to do a Zoom call. I did a live stream where I talked about hypnosis. You can watch one of those. Can we do, I went from ANCAP to Nazi, but still like your channel. Okay, I guess, thanks. That's a shift. So you decided that National Socialism works? That's what I don't understand is, I've done videos on this. If by Nazi, you just mean I'm a racist or a race realist, and I think that race is really important, fine, but like, what does that have to do with whether the government should have money or tax you or regulate the economy or you could say that, every white person is smarter than every black person, but then the logical inference from that is not, well, we need a government, at least to my lights. But okay, I am generally godsmacked by how labile and gullible the general public was from the late 1800s to early 1900s to actually accept this and think it was good. The authority people must have been enormous. Well, so it's in the United States, it's highly associated with the growth of hospital births. So when people were getting birthed at home, they weren't getting circumcised. This is even true for Jews. So we know that there were a lot of uncircumcised Jews in the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. This isn't Robert Moses, a very famous uncircumcised Jew. He actually was very wealthy. He probably was born in a hospital. He was uncircumcised because his mother believed it was a superstition and did not want her children to do superstitions. But with the rise of the rates of Americans born in hospitals, you get more and more higher rates of circumcision. By 1920 is the inflection point where we go from reaching about 50% circumcision rates. And then you reach like a critical mass by the 30s or 40s where it's a large majority. And then you have a situation where within that next generation, the doctors will be circumcised themselves and see it as normative and actually find it weird if they have uncircumcised patients or uncircumcised children. Something that didn't happen in the UK, for instance. There's also a difference. In the UK, circumcision was usually done to younger, like 10-year-old boys, and they would have a memory and then also very likely a negative memory of the process. When you circumcise boys when they're that young, but when they're old enough to remember, they often have a negative view of the process. And I've definitely met, again, guys like that who view it very, very negatively, even though they were quite young. They saw it as something that was quite horrendous. And when those people grow up, they're less likely to want to perpetuate it. The other thing that was interesting is that it achieved a certain class status where it was perceived that upper class, richer people, more sophisticated people would be circumcised, and that uncircumcised would be, a plebeian thing. And so a lot of them plebs, poorer people wanted to aspire. That could be marketed to them as like, you want your son to be like all the rich kids. When he goes to school, do you want them to make fun of him because he's a dirty immigrant from Italy? Or do you want them to think, he's a good American boy who's got, science, whatever, and that this was probably one of the things that motivated it being done. What I found interesting in the circumcision rates, do Muslims get it like Christians and Jews because they are all Abrahamic religions? Yeah, so of the three religions, Judaism mandates circumcision for men on the 8th day, with very few exceptions. They've even in the Talmud they've really lawyered this up like big time, because they would have issues where women would have a son, he would be circumcised and he would die. And then she'd have another son and he would be circumcised and he would die. And then the woman would start to ask the rabbis, like, if I have another son, are we going to kill him too? And, while a Talmudic scholar wouldn't think twice about killing a Gentile baby for any reason, killing a Jewish baby is something that deserves some attention. And I think the number they came up with was after the third death, the fourth child should be spared circumcision. Okay, so like that's where they kind of put the line. In Christianity, definite no. It's not bad, but it's not required and not necessary, and was not practiced, and it was not popularized in the United States as a religious sacrament. Now, most Americans, once they were circumcised, read the Bible and just figured, oh, this is biblical. And so they made an inference, and not an illogical one, but an erroneous one nonetheless, that the reason that they were circumcised is because the Bible says so. And that's not true if you're Christian. It is a cultural medical norm that was established for a host of reasons, all of which would now be laughable as fake and wrong. But it became popularized and now has a cultural and social inertia that is changing, but is resistant to change. Muslims, it's a little more tricky. So Muslims don't require circumcision. They think that it's laudatory, and they also Muslim men should aspire to be like Muhammad. And Muhammad was not circumcised; he was born circumcised, according to the Hadith. Now, the Quran, this is not to go into it. The Quran says very little of, it does not tell you a lot about Muhammad. There was a lot of stuff written after the Quran where they fill out his life in a lot of detail that's much more questionable. And the whole thing is questionable, but that he was born circumcised. So how do you emulate? You can't really emulate somebody who's born circumcised, because you can't be born circumcised. So it's not required, but it's like, it's laudatory or good. But Muslim society is very large and very broad, and there are cultural differences there. So there's definitely cultures where it was practiced far less or not at all, and other cultures where it was practiced universally. It's also much more common in Muslim societies to practice female circumcision. It is apparently a fact that there are no societies that practice female circumcision that don't also practice male circumcision. There are some that practice male circumcision and not female circumcision. And it is interesting when Americans and Jews and Ben Shapiro get all sanctimonious and angry about female circumcision, and then male circumcision is fine. And I did a whole video on this, but Ben Shapiro's argument was like, I had children, therefore male circumcision is not harmful. But by that logic, female circumcision is not harmful either, because females who are circumcised can still bear children. And if you indeed look at the fertility rates with, say, Egypt, which is a majority Muslim country where something like 70 to 90% of the women are circumcised, they have a higher birth rate than Israel does. So if anything, female circumcision is not just not bad, it's good, because the fertility rate is higher. I mean, the correlation is there. I'm not attributing causation, of course, but I don't know if it's just it's definitely a cultural bias. I don't know what degree of cognitive dissonance is there. Like, do they not even recognize it, or do they recognize it and they're just savvy enough to avoid having to be confronted about it? And I don't know the answer. Look, when he had Andrew Yang on his show, and Andrew Yang just said, we're not going to debate this, and I understand that Andrew Yang wanted to run for president or whatever, but that was the perfect opportunity, and they just laughed it off and didn't do it. What I found interesting is that circumcision, blah, blah, blah. I'm trans. All right. Hi, trans. I'm Dave. The status quo on medical proxy consent wouldn't be as bad if circumcision wasn't allowed to be an exception to it. Yeah, and also the the logic is shifted. So like instead of a procedure being medically necessary, which is I think a standard that most people accept, right? Oh, your son is going to die, he needs heart surgery. Well, he's only 2, so he can't consent, so there's nothing we can do. I think that it falls within the fiduciary responsibility both of the parents and of the doctor to do something that's medically necessary. But other than Brian Morris in Australia and a few other people, even the Edgar Shones of the AAP would not say that circumcision is medically necessary. At least in general, they would actually say that in cases where it wasn't. So they would say if you had phimosis, it was medically necessary, which is ridiculous. But it's only like 2% of boys are going to have phimosis. But they would say it has medical benefits. But their use of the term benefits here is a little bit misleading. They mean when they say that any issue then associated with your foreskin will be absent, and therefore it's a benefit. But we could extend that logic to amputation of any body part. So, we could if we amputate your hand, you'll never get a hangnail. You'll never get bitten in the hand by a rattlesnake. A classic example, if we gave mastectomies to girls when they were young and just did that to all of them, the rates of breast cancer would certainly fall. I mean, because there would just be less mastectomal material to get infected with cancer. It would never be a vector for infection, either bacterial or viral, and the rates would go down. And breast cancer is actually a really big killer. And yet we wouldn't do that because, yes, you could say that's a benefit because now all those things associated are gone. And like the problems with foreskins, there are problems with foreskins. They can have problems. They're just like any other body part. They're not immune from having stuff happen. Phimosis can happen, and phimosis can be a problem. It's not usually a problem, but it can be. Obviously, it does not require circumcision to be alleviated, and you can't just have a newborn baby and assume they're going to have phimosis. You have no way of knowing that until they're older. But then there are other problems you can have, but they're all very mild, and none of them are that major. And you have to take into account like the benefits of having it. Now, the benefits aren't that you'll die if you don't have it. You can survive without a foreskin for sure. But it provides a lot of pleasure, a lot of function, and the way that you have sex, the way that you jerk off, the way that you experience the universe, the sensual experience, sensual experience that you have, the sensational experience you have, it's an experientially different universe. I mean, you either think God made us that way or you think we evolved that way. Either way, to not, and it's interesting, they will do studies and say it doesn't reduce sensitivity. And they'll say that by measuring parts of the penis that are not affected by circumcision. So they'll say the midpoint of the shaft showed no decline. Yeah, okay. Well, if I chop off your right hand, your left hand won't lose any sensitivity. That doesn't mean, but all your sensitivity on your right hand is gone now. So yes, this medical benefit canard is a shift in what they use to justify it. My parents adopted some Mexican kids and got them circumcised at 1 and 6. Oh, it's too bad. 6 is insane. That's actually sadistic. In retrospect, I'm convinced the same, and I've communicated that. Now, are they old enough now that you can have a conversation with them about it, and how do they feel about it? Yeah, and it's lucky my parents agreed, and that's great, but it's a little late too. I feel about the parents. I feel bad about the parents who let the 13-year-old get cut. His circ would have been impossible without medical legal regime that allowed non-cosmetic genital mutilations. Yeah. I've disappointed many men when I tell them lack of foreskin is a deal breaker. Yeah, so this is something that seems to have happened in the last 10 years. That for most of, I mean, not most of history, but like in the post World War II era, in the gay community and in the straight community, circumcision was stigmatized. Or sorry, foreskin was stigmatized. Foreskin was bad. Foreskin was dirty. People didn't like it. Guys felt shame for it. And this was true for gay guys and for straight guys to a large extent. It seems that has shifted quite a lot. Now you still get that. I know gay guys who hate foreskin. I'm circumcised, but I've restored, and I've restored enough that a lot of times people think I'm uncircumcised, and I've been rejected a few times for that reason, which was flattering, I guess. And I know a gay guy who's Jewish, who's a doctor, and he totally fetishizes cut cocks, and he hates foreskin. He thinks foreskin's disgusting, and it makes him want to puke. Like, he uses a puke emoji when you talk about it with him. But he does advise parents to get their kids circumcised, and that's what the recommendation is. And I said, do you divulge your sexual preference and your bias that circumcision is disgusting, foreskin is disgusting? A view that is not medically justified, and of course he doesn't divulge it. He doesn't even think that that's something worth divulging, and he's also a horrible Zionist on top of everything else. But it seems though that this is starting to change, and that foreskin is becoming more and more of a plus. And now, when I've asked uncircumcised men, this is within the gay community, but the straight community, I don't know. If for those of you who are in the straight community, what is this? I'm genuinely quite interested in this. What is how do females feel about it? Are they pro, anti? Like, where does that fall? I've met heterosexual females who are like more into foreskin than I am, for sure. Like, that is a thing. And evolutionarily, it makes sense because it's female selection that's kind of picking the traits. And if females didn't like foreskin, we wouldn't have foreskins. The fact that we do have foreskins strongly implies that females like them that way, or that God made us that way, whatever you want to say. But within the gay community, at least, it's gone from like a stigma to like a bonus, and even like a preference. And some people get to the point where like, that's it. If they don't have foreskin, they're not interested. I'm not to that level, but like, I'm not too far from that level, if that makes any sense. Who's Stone Toss? Stone Toss got doxxed, and they found out he donated regularly to 4gen and mocked him for it. I don't know who Stone Toss is. Is that the latest name for somebody else who's famous for something else? If anyone knows, please comment. Is there any expectation of reciprocation? Like, will girls ever have parts amputated to medical benefit the men? Yeah. What's up, ex-Paladoc? I would guess a lot of Jews don't get it plenty, aren't very religious like Ben. Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of Jews are secular, and a lot of Jews are even dislike religion, and even specifically dislike the Jewish religion. It's one of the more unlikable religions, actually. The Christians and the Muslims have these ideas of universality, and that anyone can become one and join in brotherhood or whatever their many flaws, and they have many flaws. They have that going for them. The Jewish religion is like, we're better than everyone else, and if you're not one of us, you're scum. And if you believe in human rights or human dignity, or you have any if you adopt anything of the Enlightenment, that's something that sounds really toxic to you. Now, there are a lot of secular Jews who still have a lot of affinity and bias towards Judaism, and they love the sound, and they love the music, and maybe they love going to synagogue, and they love brises and all that stuff. But they don't. So it varies. Like, there's definitely uncut Jews is a thing. It's a growing thing. There's even uncut Orthodox Jews. I see there's a woman in Britain who's done that, and she just says, "Look, I'm Jewish. Halakha law says my son is Jewish. He's Jewish whether he is or is not circumcised. And I believe that Judaism says you should do no harm, so I'm not going to harm him. So he's uncircumcised. Now he's an adult, and he has gotten, you can see interviews with this guy. I don't remember his name, but he's like, no, you're not taking my foreskin. And I said, I have a friend who's an uncircumcised Jewish guy who is self-consciously Jewish. And when I asked him, he was like, nope, never getting it removed. Never, ever. It's never leaving. Non-negotiable. It's not happening. Yes, I'm beyond ANCAP. I'm a city-state monarchist. Oh, okay. ANCAPism would work if you have a high IQ, homogeneous culture, and closed borders. But if everyone's dumb, then the state works better. Okay. Let's see. Cozy, I think we are heading towards anarchy no matter what, as the tech that keeps coming out makes governments more and more obvious and irrelevant. More and more people really hate roads and cars. Yeah, so technology is well, that's a whole other topic, but it's I do actually believe that there's a technological function to whether you have a state or not. If there's the right technological level, you can have a state, and if there's not, you can't. And it's not a binary, but like states seem they did not exist for, as far as we can tell. And by this I mean there's literally no evidence that there were any states existed prior to, the Uruk period or the Chalcolithic period. Even when we had sedentism, even when we had large settlements with thousands of people, villages, towns, whatever you want to. I mean, Çatalhöyük is a famous example, but the Tripolian Cucuteni culture in Ukraine and Romania is another where we have these large settlements. Even in Mesopotamia, even in Jordan and Jericho and pre-dynastic Egypt, we have large populations, cities, agriculture, all these things, and we don't have states until 3000 BC, let's say. So 5,000 years. So if humans have been around 200,000 years, that's 2.5% of modern humans existing. So it's and then highly restricted. So it's not like 3,000 years ago everyone lived in a state. 5,000 years ago, it means some very small states appeared in some very specific locations, in Mesopotamia, in southern Iraq and Uruk and Ur, very soon thereafter, around the same time in the Nile Valley. And it seems that states exist when the technological ability to extort taxes is economically efficient. So if you have a situation where you can resist taxes, where it's more expensive to get the taxes than it's worth, than you can extract from doing so, then you don't have states. And so if you have hunter-gatherer cultures, you don't have states. If you have pastoralist cultures, you don't have states. If you have swidden agriculture, or even dry land agriculture, you don't have states. But then as technology changes, and that's the thing, is we see continual technological advancement at a low rate in the Neolithic and the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic. But it slowly accumulates, and through that accumulation, you get more and more people and more diversification and specialization, which builds, but it's a gradual build. And then you start to get new technologies, and then those new technologies, if depending on what they are, can sometimes facilitate taxation. And I mean, you have to have like the certain. It's not just agriculture. You have to have the certain type of crops, certain types of irrigation, certain types of monetary policy. Like if you don't have money, if everything's barter, states are very, very difficult, because it's very hard to calculate taxes. And even Like potatoes are very bad crops for states because you can't look at a potato field and know what the yield is. So I use the example like, I mean, the classic example is crypto. If crypto could be so that it would be impossible to get a hold of without you giving your password, or if it was perfectly, or not necessarily perfectly, but so difficult to track that it was just impractical, that would be something that could really hurt states. If you could Dune style have a force field on your body that made it, wouldn't have to be invincible, but like so difficult that it would cost billions or millions of dollars to get through that force field, that it would be very hard to coerce you. So the problem is predictively, I don't know. The technologies can help the state or hurt the state, and it's kind of a double-edged sword. And I'm not going to say that it's always one or the other. It does seem like it goes back and forth. There's all this idea that like feudalism ended because of gunpowder, right? That feudal states weren't really states, and that every baron had their own castle, every count, every duke, and their castle was just as good as the king's castle, and it was prohibitively difficult to conquer the castles. It was not impossible, but enormously expensive and risky, and so it just didn't happen as much. And so you had all this tremendous autonomy at the local level with the local barons and the local elites. And then with the advent of gunpowder, you had the ability to reliably breach a castle's defenses, and that gunpowder and cannon and having artillery, I shouldn't just say gunpowder, but like artillery specifically, was very, very, very expensive to the point where your normal barony or feudal fief could not sustain it, and only only the biggest single person could, and then whoever that was would become the de facto state. So like, and a lot of people don't think that modern nation states come until the period of like the post-Westphalian end of the 30 Years' War. So yeah, it's a balancing act, but it's envisionable to have technologies that invalidate the state. It's nothing to do with circumcision though. So why do you guys always talk about the stuff I'm not talking about? People will always break law, and I encourage it, but government's technology will make that harder. Yeah, it's definitely, we just don't know. I don't know either. Laws and courts should be better handled by a free market. I agree. A woman has never even asked me about it if I'm cut or uncut, and they would never reject me even if I had a Frankenstein wiener, which is the name of a book for kids. Frankenstein wiener. Yeah, this is another thing where the perception, people are really sensitive about this, and so they think that it's a big deal when it's not a big deal, in the sense that like they think, oh, I'm uncircumcised, all the girls are going to hate me, and they're probably not going to care very much. I've never met a woman who said they like it. Like what, cut or uncut? Stone Toss is a right-wing cartoonist who has made dozens of viral comics. He made several intactivist themed comics. They have white cloud people as characters. I don't think I've seen any of this. I've heard of him. As a straight man, I have no issues. No man should be ashamed. The Inca did a surprisingly good job using the potato to build a state. They developed techniques to preserve potatoes on a fairly large scale. Yeah, it helps when you're in the Andes. Yeah, technology can help either the individual or the state. It can go both ways. It can go both ways, and it does go both ways. And I'm not in the prophecy business, so I'm not going to say which way it's going to go. Sometimes there's a lot of hope, and then that doesn't pan out, and then something people didn't expect happens. So I think that it's reasonable to expect the unexpected. So also Forgin. So Forgin has been around forever. It's been around longer than my YouTube channel, and they have moved at a extremely lethargic pace, as far as I can tell. And for those of you who know, Forgin is a nonprofit company, whatever, that's attempting to restore, like to use I don't know, grafting technology and gene therapy to like create foreskins that then can be grafted onto circumcised men. And it's a great idea. The medical science is kind of there already in a lot of other ways, but there's just been not a high demand for this. And so the money just hasn't been there. They have perennial fundraising issues. They do raise funds, but the pool of men who are sufficiently interested in this to subsidize it is small. And I have always, as long as I think my first anti-circumcision video was made in 2013, so 11 years ago now. And there were people then saying, well, I'm not going to restore because of 4Gen. And like, you could be restored by now, and 4Gen might be another 10 years away. So at the rate that they're going, we're going to have cloned and reintroduced mammoths into the environment before you can order a foreskin created for you. It seems to be how it is. Let's see. What opinion of Rothbard do you disagree with the most? Oh, well, abortion. So I'm pro-life, and he was definitely not pro-life. I think he was completely wrong about that. So that's an easy one. There might be some technical ones. So I don't know. I did hear another Javier Milei. Basically, it sounds like he was a pretty much like a Keynesian until like pretty recently, like 2013 or 14. And then he was strongly influenced by Murray Rothbard's, he wrote a paper, not a book, but a paper called like Capital or Monopolies and Markets or something like that. And that seems to really have turned the tide with Javier, who the more I hear of, the more I like the guy. He is very much a doctrinaire anarcho-capitalist, it seems. Makes it easier to not need government services. They've monopolized when you have tech. I'll make my own power and everything else. Yeah. Technology is it's been this way for a while, but like it's getting easier and easier where you can achieve a high level autonomy, relatively speaking, at a low cost. Now, you always could achieve something. There always was the possibility that you could become a frontiersman and, you know, go live in Alaska in a cabin in the woods and make it your own way. You can still do that today, but you would have needed a suite of skills and a degree of fortitude that would be difficult for most people to muster. Not impossible, but difficult. And technology is progressively making that less and less the case. And not only is the technology capability, but the affordability of that technology. So there's things that you can buy on Amazon right now that you couldn't get at all 10 years ago, or they would have been prohibitively expensive. So yes, we're getting to that point where like you could have a cabin in the woods and a solar powered 3D printer, right? Like, yeah. So for people who want to go down that route, you can. And, you know, I've always had a bit of a survivalist streak. I don't take it as far as many, for sure. But like, there's always, I mean, I was a Boy Scout. The Boy Scout motto is to be prepared. And there's always part of me that's like, you should be prepared for whatever is going to happen. The state of technology has passed 4Gen by. The cutting edge is now in situ regeneration with gene therapies, mRNA, small molecules, gene indicators, and protein, like a salamander growing a new leg. Okay, but roughly speaking, that's my understanding too. This whole idea that you're going to graft it, and there was a insoluble problem. Like they can attach a bit of skin to your cock and cover your head, but then if you can't connect the nerves within that skin or that tissue to your nervous system, then like the function's not really going to be there in the same way. You'll get something out of it. But the funding and the research has just been incredibly anemic. So yeah, I think the medical industry, to the extent that it's been culpable for circumcision, which it has been, is then therefore disinterested. It's just similar, like again, to draw the parallel, WPath is never going to lead the way in detransition technology. They are never going to come out and be like, these are the things that can help you detransition. They're not gonna develop anything like that, because it would be a rebuke and a repudiation of everything that they've made their purpose. And so you can't expect them to do that. Now, with circumcision, it's not restricted to a certain, it's not like, oh, only pediatricians do it. Like, the guilt is spread over the entire medical industry, but then the entire medical industry then has really no incentive to question it or to do anything about it, because to do so would then risk admitting fault, or even worse, liability. Okay, top 2, 3 things you disagree with him on. Well, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look. I'll be honest. It's been a minute since I read any Rothbard. I've read a lot of Rothbard, but I haven't. It's been a while. There are a lot of personality things about him, like that he didn't like Star Wars. Okay, so he thought Star Wars was a bad movie. So that's pretty dumb. That's totally wrong. That he lived on Manhattan for a very long period and was afraid to leave Manhattan. Like, he had a fear of crossing a bridge, and he just stayed on Manhattan forever, which is really sad and pathetic. But that's a personal thing. That's not like an ideological thing. I don't know if I mean, I believe he believed in a free market and money. If he was a gold standard person, I wouldn't agree with that, but I don't think he was. I doubt if foreskin regeneration would ever get beyond a medical ethics board in the USA, specifically due to the conflict of interest and the admission of liability. Yeah, this is the big problem. And this also is a problem in the courts. Like, right now, the status of, like, well, is this harm? Is this this procedure, is there a liability here? Well, the courts are then going to defer to authorities, and the authorities are going to be the people who are guilty, or potentially guilty anyway. And so they're going to come down on the side of, no, this isn't harmful and there's no liability here. You can't sue me for having done this to you, unless they botch it or you specifically told them not to get it done. Interestingly, like, the only kind of big legal victories that the intactivists have gotten actually were from Hasidic Jews. There was a case, I don't know when it was, but a Jewish family, they wanted to circumcise their son, but they didn't want him to circumcise them in the hospital. They wanted to have the ceremony on the 8th day. So they wanted to take him home intact and then, do the humane thing and have the mohel rip his foreskin off and then suck the blood out with his mouth and maybe give him herpes. They wanted to do it the Ben Shapiro way. But that begins your life with oral sex from an older man. Okay, great. But the hospital just automatically circumcised the boy in the hospital, right? They just did it, without asking. And the family was understandably upset, although I would say for the wrong reasons. And so it's become, I guess hospitals have become a lot more stringent of, like, making sure that they know that they have the consent of the parents. But there's also evidence that they kind of play fast and loose, where, like, they'll have a mother potentially who's, like, maybe on drugs, maybe out of it, and they'll give her a clipboard and they'll check these 10 things. And one of the things that she checked, can we operate if there's an emergency? Can we transfer you to another hospital if necessary? Blah, blah, blah. Can we bill your insurance, and you want to circumcise your boy? And boom, they check them all. So yeah, it seems to the degree that hospitals really push it, that's a good question as to why. I mean, there's a simple answer in that it's a thing that they can charge for, so they have a financial incentive to do it. That's obviously part of the answer, but it does also seem to be more than that. That there's a certain culture, and this, again, it's not universal, it's not everywhere, of, this is done, this needs to be done. See, I like Hoppe, but he's so conservative, and the anti-gay stuff really bothered me. So if the anti-gay stuff is just the homosexuals have high time preference, I'm going to say that's, being told that you have high time preference, even if it's not true, it's not the worst insult. Now, if there's more, I think he probably is socially conservative. But, he's a right to be socially conservative. He doesn't talk about, when he talks about forcibly evicting people, he doesn't talk about forcibly evicting gays, unless I'm wrong. He talks about forcibly evicting communists, and he doesn't conflate them as being the same thing. Let's see. Home birth is the way to go to avoid hospitals. Yeah. I'm convinced that the sunk cost is the major driver for continued medical support for circumcision. Yeah, it is inertial. It is, if they were to reverse the policy, it would imply that something was wrong with the policy, and then that would at least seem to open the door, at least hypothetically, to liability issues, and they could be massive. I think that they're maybe being paranoid because only a small fraction of circumcised men are going to feel sufficiently aggrieved to do anything about it. Of course, if there's a financial incentive, maybe more would decide that they feel aggrieved. Let's see. For all of history, two guys having sex didn't turn them into some special people being themselves. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Also, why is your name Expal Odoc, not Expaladoc? In your opinion, how do we understand when would you feel animal rights? Oh, expel back to my other channel. Yeah, it's hard enough for us to establish human rights. I think humans are playing by the same rules that the animals are, by and large, where they're killing each other and competing with each other all the time, and we're just the best at it. There's things that could be said of the more intelligent the animals are, the more you maybe want to consider that and think about that. And so, so killer whales, they're among the most intelligent animals out there. And, there's part of me is like, man, it's just to have that be in SeaWorld, that seems like an awful life. But then if a killer whale wasn't in SeaWorld, it would just be out killing like baby seals and baby whales. And so like they are literally giant murder machines. So I don't know how bad am I supposed to feel, like a lions spend their life. And when humans kill animals, it's true we do. And I don't really feel guilty about it. And might even say, Stephen Ranella wise, that if you're not hunting the animal yourself, it's somehow maybe worse that you're just having others do the dirty work. But the way that humans kill animals is like surgically quick and humane relative to the way that most animals are killed. The way lions kill prey is horrifying. Like, I don't know. When I was a kid, I watched a lot of nature documentaries, but they edit them. They'll show the part where the lion will jump on the buffalo and knock it down, and then maybe the next scene it will be licking a defleshed bone. But like watching it actually, watching the 20 minutes or 30 minutes it takes when they're using their carnassers to shear open the guts and then eat the guts while the animal is still kicking and bellowing for help. It's just hard to say, well, we humans are so bad. or to watch killer whales suffocate or pummel, whales or pinnipeds. So, Test. Stephen Coe's at work. I can see it says test. Yeah. If a man does something with a doll, he's not suddenly a toy sexual. If someone says an AI is the, if someone says a guy is their girlfriend, but they don't get a parade with the computer next to him. Well, at least not yet. Gay is word magic. I still don't understand what you're saying. About half my messages go public. Oh, yeah. There's been a lot of. I've been getting a lot of people saying like their stuff isn't, like they'll post comments and like they won't show. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just a glitch or if people are what. Like I noticed that I was watching Andrew Gold interview some psychiatrist about, again, the trans issue. And I noticed that every time she said the word pedophile, that it was bleeped out, like every single time, to the point where it was somewhat confusing about what she was necessarily saying. And I was wondering if there's some kind of YouTube prohibition against using that term. I don't know. I mean, I just said it then. Can you guys tell what I said? Um, My biggest concern is that I'm 28. Communism and socialism are spreading like wildfire. Like libertarians, conservatives are losing the culture war and economically. Yeah, I don't know what the basis of. What do you mean communism is spreading by fire? Communism has been like in decline for a long time now. There's been this, what would be the term? The critical uh, the Marxists in academia and all of their weird critical theories, critical race theory, critical gender theory, all that stuff, all the stuff that James Lindsay is so good about. But that is like and that stuff is really bad. Don't get me wrong, but it's like a toxin, but it doesn't really like create anything. It doesn't really, right. It's not creating communism. It's trying to pollute the society that exists, but it's not like a communist party that's trying to take over the state and then is going to execute it. Like I think that yeah. So I would argue socialism, those who want it are growing. Well, the state is growing, and you could say that the state is socialist, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But as an ideology, I think socialism and communism is really, it has an appeal because there's always an appeal to people who are jealous and who are envious. But like as like people are not reading Das Kapital and like this is what we need to do. Like that's just such a unappealing ideology for the vast majority of people. And here on YouTube and most places, not being edgy, making fun of far left socialists is what people are into. Yeah, I mean, look, and I think that you're wrong about the culture. I think that many institutions are controlled by the left and controlled by a lot of cultural Marxists, but that these institutions are largely ossified and also largely discredited, right? People don't have a high opinion of academia. They don't have a high opinion of the media. And there's been like an explosion of media that's independent of that. And, I've ragged on Ben Shapiro plenty of times here. And like, I could rag on him on many other issues. But like he's not a Marxist, he's not a cultural Marxist, and he's wildly popular, So big trend I've noticed is that there's a lot more open criticism of Jews. Yeah, how about this? Did you guys see like Chuck Schumer? Like Chuck Schumer is Jewish, so this wasn't anti-Jewish, but like, man, I can't believe the stuff he was saying about Israel. I mean, Israel is really making people choose sides. And the longer this goes, it's making more and more people choose not their side. Like, it's really, incredibly stupid. And there are people who argue that there's something about the Jewish culture that pushes them to accentuate their otherness and their difference and their distinction from everybody else, and to rub it in your face. And when you mix it with the transparent loathing and double standard for which they hold the world, that that uh, they will eventually piss off enough people that something bad will happen. And I personally do not wish for that. I think that's very unlikely, say, in the United States. Uh, the worst thing that's ever happened in the United States to Jews is that in 1862, William Tecumseh Sherman issued a proclamation telling all Jewish merchants to leave the city of Paducah, Kentucky, and Abraham Lincoln rescinded that order like within a day. Okay, so like, and that's pretty tame. I mean, who likes to be in Paducah, Kentucky anyway? Right? that is not a pogrom by, as we would understand it in any sense of the word. And I certainly don't wish that. I want the Jews to be happy. I think the Jews in America have it great, and I would rather Jews live in America than live in Israel, to be perfectly honest. It would be nice if they didn't circumcise their sons, and it would be nice if they weren't Zionists, but not all of them are. And look, I mean, we're talking about Rothbard. Rothbard's obviously a Jew, and I've read so many Jews, and Jews have contributed so much. I mean, it's stupid to talk about it as a group, but individual Jews certainly have. But there's also evidence that like their religion, and I could do a whole video on this. The material is endless in the stuff that the Talmud says against non-Jews. That you should curse their cemeteries, that you should curse them, that you should never help them, that their life is absolutely meaningless next to a Jew, that they have no value, that the only exception is if you have a Gentile who's a powerful ruler who you're subject to, then you should flatter and praise them and satisfy them, but not everybody else, which is a recipe for disaster. So this is many people believe this is one of the reasons why they were so hated in places like Poland and in Russia, where you had a nobility that ostensibly owned the land, but then they would basically rent out its management to Jewish middlemen. And those Jewish middlemen then, on the behest and at the behalf of the feudal overlord in Warsaw or in Moscow, would then exploit the serfs, the Gentile mass peasant population, and then they would take it out on the Jews, the middleman, right? But there was a process that happened basically during the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, where a lot of Jews who were educated Jews, like rabbis, people who had been to yeshiva, people who really knew the Talmud really well, converted to Christianity. And that was really damaging to Judaism because they really spilled the beans. I mean, I guess the Christians up to that point, they obviously knew Jews existed, but they weren't so learned in it. And it's, I mean, look, they're saying that, again, this is the point I made earlier. Judaism post in the Common Era has in many ways become like the anti-Christianity. And one example is this: all the stuff it says about Jesus, that Jesus is in hell, that Jesus is burning in a lake of burning excrement forever. And like, obviously, before Common Era Judaism, first and second temple Judaism didn't have any of that stuff about Jesus, because Jesus didn't exist yet. And yet that's such a prominent feature. And there's all this, the worst thing, right? But what is a Christian going to think about your religion and about you if you hold that religion, right? And I still, I mean, Ben Shapiro, again, just to take him as an example, but he's representative of a lot of people. Like, he's very explicit about how he's Talmudic, and he, Jewish holiday this, Jewish holiday that. And then he's got like Matt Walsh there. Like, what? Like, how do you square that circle? Like it doesn't fit. It doesn't compute. Again, tolerance, believe whatever you want, get along. You can be as parochial as you want. Um, I actually believe in the freedom of association. If someone wants to say, hey, we're going to have just Jews only here, we're going to have yeshiva only for Jews, we're going to have only Jew this, only Jew that. Yeah, I'm fine. But everybody should have that right. There shouldn't be universalism for everybody else, but then freedom of association for certain groups, uh, uh, in-group preferences are the norm if you're not European. It's one thing to have an in-group preference. It's another thing to say everyone who's not in the in-group is worthless and every single member of the in-group is better than every single member of the out-group, right? By recognizing a universal human right and a universal human dignity, you can actually do business and treat others with respect, and that's really, really powerful. If you are and if you still believe in a freedom of association, that doesn't sacrifice anything on your end. So the fact that you can do business with an African and do commerce and respect their rights and expect them to respect yours, that doesn't mean then that you have to marry an African woman, okay, or have sex with an African or accept their religion or anything like that. But if you take an eternally antagonistic view, a xenophobic view, you are very limited. And I think that it says a lot that the universalist religions have taken over the world, whereas the particularist religions have not. So Judaism has stayed forever small and weak, and at the mercy of the two big universalist religions, Islam and Christianity, which have been vastly, vastly more successful by every metric, in every way, to the point where now Judaism has to exist at the behest and the whim of other religions, essentially. Even with the state of Israel, they're still kind of in that position. Have you ever read Ron Unzi? Nope, I don't know who that is. I'm not familiar. What do they write about? Jews are also long-term thinkers who like to invest. Best thing you can do is long-term is have empathy, compassion, forgiveness, honesty, treat others as you would want to be treated. Yeah, that's all true. I've never heard one Jewish person my entire life directly say or imply a non-Jewish belong. Well, let me be specific. When I'm saying these things about Judaism, I'm talking about the tenets of the religion, right? I'm talking about what the Talmud says. And it is absolutely true that many Jews have never read the Talmud. Many Jews have read the Talmud and only believe bits and pieces of it. Many Jews have read the Talmud and they hate the Talmud, right? There are many secular Jews. There are many atheist Jews. There's many Jews who hate Judaism, the religion, as much or more than anybody else. So, and yet these people are still Jews, right? So this is the complex thing with the term. When you say Jews or Jewish, are you talking about the religion? Are you talking about a culture? Are you talking about a race? And it's all complicated, but you can specify the religion and you can look at the religious texts, and they are. So now, Orthodox Hasidic Jews, they seem to take that stuff relatively seriously, although how they interpret it does vary from sect to sect, person to person. And you have a lot of Jews who reject all that stuff. So again, the idea that, well, whatever the Talmud says or doesn't say, that it's not an excuse to then treat all Jews a certain way. But to the extent that they believe in the book, and like you can see, this is a big problem in Zionism, because the religious Jews, the ones who read the Talmud and believe in it, just look at all the Palestinians like Amalek, and that we can take all their land. It's not their land, it's our land forever. God gave it to us. and they're inferior to us anyway, and so we're going to go, and if we want to go and build a settlement and steal their water and burn their crops and kill their children and kill their livestock and do whatever we want, we can do that, and it's perfectly fine. Now, there's plenty of people in Israel who don't agree with that, who think that's stupid or wrong or ethical, right? And there's plenty of Jews in America who don't look at this. You know, Scott Horton said 95% of Jews in America are Democrats, and they would say that they believe in human rights and that human rights would apply to Palestinians. And that's not what they're getting. They have not been getting that since 1948. And yeah, this is a huge problem. So again, that's what I'm talking about. Ron Utsi writes a lot of revolutionist history articles on American history. Oh, I've never heard of them. The other thing about even and then among secular Jews, there's like a big, you know, a lot of them adopt certain cultural things. So I remember reading ones like Jewish people are impressed often that, you know, their culture is super ancient and super old, and that there's this antiquity to it, and that makes them special. And it's not wrong in the sense that, like, Judaism is a religion that's been around a long time. There is a very long history there. There are other things that are older, for sure. Egypt is way older. Mesopotamia is way older. China is older, probably, right? But it's also kind of, there's a certain collectivism there that's really kind of silly. Like, if you're 25, you're 25. And the fact that you have a name that you can find in a book that was written maybe in this 5th century BCE, that doesn't make you old. That doesn't mean you experienced that. And everybody who's alive today, every single person, they can trace their ancestor back to Luca, right? Or Equatorial Eve, or the last common ancestor. And every language that exists today can trace, you know, unless you speak Esperanto or Elvish or Klingon, you speak a language that had ancestor languages that go back as far as every other ancestor language. We don't always have the attestation of that, right? The oldest Indo-European language that we have attested is Hittite, but we know Indo-European goes back before Hittite. It had to have. And there's Proto-Indo-European, and that's older than any Semitic language that currently exists or was ever attested. I think Hittite is the oldest Semitic attested language is actually Eblamite. It's not Hebrew, it's Eblamite. And I think even Akkadian is Semitic. I'm not sure. But the point is that it's kind of arbitrary to draw this line and be like, oh, see, Jewishness is 5,000 years old and Christianity is only 2,000 years old. You're not 2,000 years old. You're not 5,000 years old. B, you can always trace the history farther back, and everyone alive, every culture, every history can go back as far as everyone else's history. And this idea, there's a certain bigotry of, and it's not just Jews do this, Chinese people do this, like Russians do this. Like there's something where people want to say that they have this antiquity, and they want to make this continuity, imply that there's this strong cultural or religious or racial continuity that goes back. And the farther they can push it back, like the more legitimacy, authority, or status their relative religion has. I just think that's fundamentally wrong. But many Jews are taught this, and then they grow up feeling like there's something special about being Jewish. Well, okay, special how? You had half your dick cut off. Okay, great. Zionism was and is a non-religious movement. I don't know much about it. That's super complicated. I mean, the first Zionists were secular and even anti-religious, and Herzl famously, to tie it back, actually, Theodor Herzl, who I think really is considered like the father of Zionism, he toyed with the idea of them converting to Catholicism. He didn't circumcise his own sons, and they were very secular. And the early Zionist movements, it was basically these communists, these socialists, the labor Zionists, these Ashkenazi, and then they moved to Israel. There were some small Jewish communities already there that were religious, but then religious communities started to move there, and now I think it's like 45% of Israel are like Hasidic Jews. Is this about Ominous Parallels by Peikoff? Hey, somebody got the reference. So John Way, no, it's not, but I am directly referencing the book by Leonard Peikoff, Ominous Parallels. But no, this is actually the ominous parallels between WPath and the AAP, circumcision and trans. He's a publisher of American Conservative for a while. He is a Jewish counter-Semite. What is a counter-Semite? Never heard that term. Oh, okay. Isn't that interesting that you can't write anti-Semite even to call it out? Like how ridiculous is that? It's not like bleeping out my words, is it? Like I can say, I don't know, Zog or the Holocaust never happened or whatever. Yes, we all go back to the beginning. I disagree. There's something special. Howard Stern, Seth Rogen, etc., all come off as having negative views of themselves and Judaism. Again, yeah, some of them do, and like they have different religious views. Look, Reform Jews don't agree with Orthodox Jews for all kinds of reasons, and even within Orthodox, there's all these different brands, and like secular Jews all over the place. There's secular Jews in Israel. There's Zionists who are like, we should just give the entire West Bank to the Palestinians. We should give them half of Jerusalem. I don't care. It's not my business. It would make peace, and which it would. That would be the best thing that they could do. And they're Jewish and they feel that way. And there's other Jews who are like, they're Amalek and we belong. So like, it's a very diverse group. They're not filtering your words live, but they might when you activate the stream. Yeah. And as far as I know, the only video I've ever had taken down was one, it was titled Holocaust Denial, where I didn't deny the Holocaust. I just said it shouldn't be a crime to deny the Holocaust. I never seen Dune or read it, but looks good. I read the first two books in high school, and I saw the David Lynch film, and I've seen the film, and it's quite good. All right, guys. 2-hour stream, getting late. Final questions. Is my nose still bleeding? No. Well, I haven't worked in the oil patch in 5 years, so I don't know. I think, it's interesting. Like the Biden administration, like the Democrats always are like anti-oil until oil prices get high, and then they're like drill, baby, drill. Like this whole thing with Russia has really, Russia's really helped the U.S. oil industry hugely by taking themselves out of the market essentially, and reminding the Democrats that wind and solar is no substitute for hydrocarbons. But I'm not benefiting personally. To increase my ANCAP knowledge, top 3 books for people to read. Yeah, The Problem with Political Authority by Michael Huemer, Power and Market by Rothbard, and gosh, if I had to pick a third, maybe The Myth of National Defense by Hoppe. Read the Leo Frank case and the origins of the ADL. Okay, yeah. So that I haven't read that by him, but I've definitely heard of that. So that was a guy who was a child murderer, rapist, who got convicted, and then the ADL wanted to prevent him from being executed. Like, because he was Jewish, that he shouldn't be killed, even though he was obvious. Like, there was no question that he was guilty. I wish I could pick your brain more. I would pay for that. How much would you pay? Maybe I'll consider it. But I mean, you don't mean literally pick my brain, because that would be horrible. What would be the third? Yeah, definitely a problem with political authority. Just went straight to the top of my list. Power and Market by Rothbard, which is the end of there's Man, Economy, and State is the larger thing, and then Power and Market's the end. Another good one is Libertarianism Today. That's not specifically ANCAP. I guess, oh, well, Machinery of Friedman would also be a good one. I should have said that. Bourgeoisie Dignity is great. That's funny. We're talking about her because she is trans, right? Deidre, formerly Donald McCloskey. And you never hear about her because she's super trans, but she's super like free market libertarian. So she's kind of canceled doubly. That book may not be ANCAP, but Lengthy loves it, so I mentioned it. Yeah, I mean, Deidre, I don't think identifies as an ANCAP, but she definitely identifies with ANCAPs. And there's a part in the book where she kind of lets the veil slip. She's very even-handed throughout the books, actually, but she lets it slip at the end. Like, the people who believe in human flourishing, and she gives a list, and Rothbard's on the list, Mises, Rothbard, Kerzner, right? So those are great books. They are among the most iconoclastic books that I've read. Didn't know they were trans. Yeah, Deidre McCloskey was formerly Donald McCloskey, and she transitioned a long time ago. She wrote a book, I think it's called Transition or something, that was a New York Times bestseller before Bourgeoisie. But Donald was an accomplished economist at the Chicago School of Economics, I believe. So his first books are for him. He is no longer connected with his family. They tried to institutionalize him. They put him in a mental ward, and they took away his legal rights. This all happened as an adult, obviously, and I'm glad that he got out. They got out, and he's definitely one that doesn't pass. Having met him in person, I saw him at Students for Liberty maybe in 2017 or 18, and like he doesn't quite pull it off. I think he transitioned when he was in his 50s, though. I'm a men's bathrooms user. That's my identity. I was going to ask you, how many sons did you have? And what was it my influence that made you not have them be circumcised? Or were you going to not circumcise them anyway? And that was like, had nothing to do with me. I know that I've influenced some people to not do it because they've told me. Wow. Are you going to tell them that it was a random gay anarchist on YouTube that convinced you to, or contributed, sorry, to not have them be circumcised? I mean, I had a roommate for many years. He got married and had 2 sons, and they're both uncircumcised. That's fair. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't get, among my subscriber base, like literally none of them have ever really debated the circumcision thing. It seems like it's been a no-brainer. I think that there's an older generation of libertarians, like the former libertarians like Walter Block, who would argue that, it's something that's justifiable. But I mean, you asked me about Rothbard. Rothbard was probably in favor of circumcision, so he would definitely be wrong about that. Although, to be fair, in his time, it was generally believed that neonates were like vegetables, that they weren't, not only were they not fully developed, which is true, they're not fully developed, but like they couldn't feel pain, they had no emotion, right? That they were like slugs basically, and that's wrong. Uh, yes, they're not fully developed, but they can feel pain, they have emotions, they have their it doing that to them is quite torturous. Never mind the lasting effects after. But yeah, I think Rothbard was pro circumcision. He probably never wrote about it because it would have been taken for granted for his generation, but he definitely would have been wrong about that. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. Of course, the stream slowly gets bigger as we go, and they got the most people viewing right now, but it is late. There's other stuff I want to practice a little bit. But thank you all for watching, and have a great night.